the template, there's the risk response that I was referring to. So this is where we had our exercise where we talked about acceptance, avoidance, reduction, and sharing. And just a reminder that in general, the most common response is going to be reduction. However, acceptance is a close second, and then avoidance and sharing are more rare. So then you're going to identify your control activity. This is your internal control. This is your risk mitigation. This is what you're putting in place to ensure that the risk does not occur. And then we're going to talk a little bit more about that in the next couple of slides. And then you have control number. So control number, this is where a lot of folks have hangups, and we understand that the Navy currently does not have a lot of standardized documentation associated with processes and controls. So there may not be a control number, and that's totally fine. I know that some people, they base a lot of their risks and the associated controls off of instructions that they have. And so they numbered their controls based on the instruction section. So if there's a way for you to be able to identify your control in a unique way that supports it, you're certainly welcome to create your control numbers. And as we get better about documenting our processes and having actual control numbers, we'll be able to put more of those in there. But it's perfectly fine if you don't have a control number. You don't need to create one. You don't need to go find one. You can just say NA. And then control type. Again, this is where it could be multiple areas. It could be financial system and financial reporting. It could be operational and financial. Just pick the one that's most, where it leans the most. So moving on to the next slide. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about common feedback for control activities. We had a lot of individuals indicate NA for a control activity. And so a lot of our feedback has been, well, you've indicated that you don't have a control in place to mitigate this risk. And basically that means that you have some sort of a gap in place. So you're going to need to identify that either management has determined that they're accepting the risks and there's no action that's going to be taken, in which case you would say NA in the deficiency column, and then in the control activity column, you would want to actually say management accepts the risk and provide some additional information of why the risk is being accepted and that it's been acknowledged and all of that. So we just want to make sure that's a very common comment that we've had to provide to multiple MAUs and BSOs. And so again, this is where I say if you're going to select acceptance, then you explain why management is accepting the risk. And if you decide that you're not okay with accepting the risk and it's a gap and you have a deficiency, then you would complete the deficiency information. Next slide. Okay, so another comment that we have a lot is that an organization has identified several control activities in one row to address a particular risk, which is fine. However, the way the current spreadsheet works and the mechanics of the spreadsheet is that if you indicate that you're going to test a control, then it automatically populates into the ICE tab. And if you've identified multiple controls that don't link with each other in one cell, then all of those controls are going to come over in one row on the ICE, and you may not actually be testing all of the activities that you are identifying. So our recommendation is that for each distinct control activity, if it doesn't work together with the other ones, that you include it on a separate row. So a risk can have multiple controls associated with it. That's perfectly fine. And then that way you can select which ones you're going to test, so that you aren't necessarily indicating that you're going to test everything. You may not be able to do that. So that way only the ones that you select for testing will come over into the ICE spreadsheet. And it just makes things more smooth when it comes to the mechanics of the current process that we have. So that's a common comment. We'll move on to the next slide. Okay, so some more control activity comments. So sometimes we'll read a control activity description, and it'll look like it's in the future tense. So it might say you're developing a policy. It might say that you're developing a control, or it's just very clear that that whatever you're talking about, it doesn't appear that it's actually happening yet. So we provide feedback, just indicating that it doesn't look like it's actually happening yet. It seems to be in the future state. If that's the case, it means it's really more control that's in remediation, and we would recommend that there be a supporting deficiency and CAP associated with it. It's perfectly fine to indicate what you're going to have in place, but it should be more clear that it's still in remediation. So that's our typical feedback related to that one. Next. Okay, so I believe this is our last polling question. So we'll skip over to that. Choose a good control activity description includes the following. So yes, at almost 2 hours into the training, we did kind of throw you guys a softball, because everybody's probably sick of hearing me at this point, and didn't want to overtax you. But the answer is all of the above. So all of the above. We need to have who performs the control, how and when the control is performed, and how the control is documented and evidenced. And if for no other reason, the reason you want to include this stuff is because if you're going to test it, you're going to need to know all this stuff in order to develop your test plan. So one thing that I also advise my customers is that when you're developing the risk assessment, you may not have all of this information. It automatically populates over into your ICE. When you get to your ICE and you actually do understand more about the control, you should update the control activity description to be more clear and to include all of these elements. All right, next slide. Matt? Thank you. Okay, so the next part of the template, residual risk rating. So it's also so FY21 testing. So that first column is going to be, so for the first risk that first control that you've identified, for that control activity, are you going to be testing it this year? And it's a yes, no. If you say yes, then it automatically populates onto the ICE tab of the spreadsheet. Okay, and so then you get into residual risk, and this is where now you've put your control in place, and it's a control that's actually in place and it's actually operating. You may not have tested it yet, but based on assuming that it's working the way you intended, now what is your level of risk? What is the likelihood of the risk occurring, and what would the impact be? And you typically would like to see these numbers go down, based on the fact that you put controls in place to manage that risk. And then, so this is where when you start looking through the residual risk, let's say you put a control in place, you're thinking through how effective it's going to be, and it's sticking you right around. You went from a 5 to a 3, but you really want it to be a 1. So this is a situation where you're going to then go and identify an additional control, which is the next part of the spreadsheet. However, if the residual risk is where you like it, then that next part of the spreadsheet, you could just indicate NA controls sufficient, first control sufficient or something like that. You don't have to provide an additional control. You may also want to provide, if you have something that's in remediation and is an additional control, or it's going to replace the control that's currently being identified, you may include that as your additional control, just to indicate that there is additional work that's in process. So that's residual risk. Let's move on to the next slide. Matt, I'm not sure what's going on with your screen, but it's dark. There we go. Okay, so the next piece then is, as I mentioned, you identify your additional risk. Same columns as the other control activity. You identify your control number if there is one, otherwise it's just NA, your control type, and then whether or not if this control is a control that is also in place and operating, then are you going to also test that? And so if you say yes, then that also will populate over into your ICE template as another row. Next slide. Okay, and then the next piece is identifying risk priority. And so this is one of the areas where we're asked for a lot of guidance on priority, and we've put it in this 1, 2, 3 type situation. Where 1 is the highest priority and the stuff where you want to spend the most time and focus. If you're meeting with management, maybe when you provide a consolidated, view to management, you may be filtering and just showing them the priority 1 items. There may be 2s and 3s that are important for you guys to manage at your level, but maybe only the 1s are actually communicated up to your leadership. But this is just a way to better prioritize which risks and controls are most important to your organization and have the largest impact on your mission objective. And then the final column there, and just as a best practice, it might be helpful for you to define criteria for yourselves for what would go into a priority 1, what would go into a priority 2 and a 3, just so that you have a criteria to follow. But like I said, each of the organizations is a separate organization because it has a different purpose than every other organization. So coming up with that criteria for a lot of folks is going to be different and case by case. If you would like assistance with that, you're more than welcome to reach out to your government lead on our team, and we are happy to walk through it with you, but we just can't speak in generalities in this area. And then finally, risk owner, name of contact. And this is more for you guys to manage getting information, updating information. We will not be reaching out and talking to these people without going through you if we need to know more about one of those items, because we want to include it in our risk assessment.